All right. Good afternoon. Welcome. This is Troubleshooting Windows 10 Deployment. I'm Johan. I will be your host for the next 60 minutes. I absolutely love questions. If you have any, just out with them, and I'll be happy to answer. Now, this conversation or this session doesn't only live here in Oslo in Spectrum in Norway. It also lives online. So I am following a Twitter feed, the NICconf Twitter feed on this laptop over here. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them there as well. And as the headline says for this slide, if you're not on Twitter, get on Twitter. You will hear me say that every single session throughout this conference, simply because there is no better medium to keep up what's going on in the Windows 10 deployment space, and of course a bunch of other topics as well. So follow me. Check the people I follow, people like Kent over there and Michael in the stairway there, and a bunch of other gurus, mentors, experts in the OS deployment field. So if you tag the questions with this, I have at least a chance to find them in the Twitter feed or in the stream. Now, my normal work, my daily work is to travel around this globe helping customers implement config manager and MDT solutions. And I've been doing that for a long, long time. But I do find time to write books, do presentations, and I do some trainings. So it's try to balance that as best as I can. Now, today we'll focus on MDT and config manager. There's a mix in between them, but most of the stuff from an OS deployment point of view is exactly the same, no matter which solution you actually use to deploy Windows 10 with. So even if I sometimes just talk about the light touch feature, it will be applicable to config manager. And the same goes the other way around. I will talk about stuff in config manager, and it will happen the same for light touch, or be the same for light touch. Now, some assumptions here. This is a level 400 session. So if you've never seen Windows 10 deployment or MDT or config manager in your life, it might be a little bit overwhelming. But if you're not too afraid for Notepad or scripts or log files or command prompts or PowerShell prompts, I think we should get along just fine here today. Now, I've been doing troubleshooting sessions for as long as I can remember, and this has been a part of it always. This was one of the very first, very common error messages back when SMS 2003 got the feature pack for OS deployment back in November 2004, Copenhagen, Denmark. Bill Gates was going down to kick off the first wall of fire. They had in the keynote hall at the Bella Center of the first IT Forum conference, they had 100 computers running Windows 2000. And they re-imaged them live within 10 minutes to XP in front of the entire keynote audience. So they had colorful backgrounds on the machines, and you can see they actually restore the backgrounds afterwards. But this was a very common error message back in those days, and it still is. So what is it? What does it mean? Well, it basically means that whatever you were hoping for, you didn't get. This is just a very generic error message. Basically say, hey, I don't know. Go find out. Check the log files, do something. So every time you see this, this is not a real error message. That is just something went wrong, I don't know why. Now, this is the top 10 tips and tricks session, so I added numbers to the slides so I can keep track of them. First out, when doing troubleshooting for both MDT and config manager, when things go wrong, you turn to the log files. And they are written in a format to be read by the cmtrace utility. Notepad works, but cmtrace is better. First, it does some nice encoding of the log files themselves. It does some coloring for warnings and errors, and has some lookup features, and it's also real-time. So if you open a log file while the machine is deploying, you can actually see it scroll through. Notepad doesn't do that. Now, in terms of the locations, well, depends on what you're deploying. For config manager, the main log file is the SMSTS log file. It used to have the problem it was too small. It used to be only 1 megabyte in size, and a lot of junk in it too. They fixed that now in, well, back in SP1 really, but it's 15.11, the current version of config manager, current branch, it's 2 megs. And they also reduced the number of junk in it, so you actually get some valid info in that log file. But for light touch deployment, this is not useful much. For light touch deployment is the BDD log file, that is your main log file. That one exists in config manager too, but will only log the BDD or MDT specific actions. So for config manager, it's this file. For MDT, it's the BDD log file. Now, that being said, if I just kick off Zoom here, so I can do some fancy. This one can be useful for light touch deployments. What component or what type of deployment in light touch can this file be really useful for troubleshooting? It's only one thing. Application deployments. If you use a light touch sequence to deploy apps, which you typically do, this file can be really useful to figure out why the app failed during deployment. The BDD log file will tell you nothing, but this one will. But again, for config manager, this is it. Now, if you like it to use config manager, it's already included in the boot image. For light touch deployments, it's not. So how do you add that to the light touch component? Or the light touch boot image? Well, first you need to have it. And there's been a long debate among the config manager MVPs and the product team lately if you're allowed to use it or not. Because it's available as a free download. That has been for a long, long time. It's been part of the config manager 2012 R2 toolkit and the non-R2 toolkit before that. But if you lead that license agreement, you're only allowed to use these tools if you have a config manager. It's tied to the config manager license. I know they're working on changing this, but for now the statement is, hey, you know what? There is a config manager eval version for evaluation. Has that file. Use it for now, and you should be good. So, shorthand story, find the file somewhere, and then you will simply go to your site server, MDT server. You will pick 64-bit version for 64-bit boot images and a 32-bit version for 32-bit boot images. Do not pick the one in the tools folder. Because when you have config manager, any version really, there will be a tools folder in the setup. This one is the 32-bit file that contains the 64-bit file. And Windows PE cannot unpack it. Windows can, but WinPE cannot. So you will get it from the OSD folder instead, because this is where you find the 32 and 64-bit native versions. Once you have them, well, quite easy. You open up your deployment server, log in with the super secret password, and you'll find your deployment chair. And what you do is you create a folder structure. For example, extra files. For example, 32-bit. And system32. This is where you place the seam trace file for 32-bit. And of course, you would do the same for 64-bit. And in here, you will place the 64-bit file. Because then the only thing you need to do is go to your deployment chair, Properties, go to the WinPE tab, and either paste in or browse that folder. And don't be surprised if this console crashes when you do this. It's been like that for 5 years, so it's still like that. So whenever you do a change in the WinPE Customizations tab, this one here, take a habit of hit apply every once in a while. See? Crashing. And you need to start Task Manager and kill it and try again. That's one option, if you like to do that. Or there is another option. Begins with a P, useful for automation. PowerShell. Helps to have a unique last name. Here we go. Configuring a deployment chair using PowerShell. Not too hard. Import a module, create a drive, configure whatever setting you like. Can be done through PowerShell. And this is actually how MDT does it. It's calling a PowerShell provider in the back end to do the configuration. And this never crashes. So either way, get those settings in, because once you have them configured, the next time you update the deployment chair, it will automatically inject the SIEM-trace component into that folder, into the boot image. And since I specify the root to be this, it will put them in Windows System 32 in the boot image. So it's automatically added to the path as well. So then you can open SIEM-trace. So that's nice. Now, next step. By default, every single log file, both MDT and config manager, are on the client side. So if something fails, like really early in the process, you will find the log files on the X drive in RAM. So for config manager, it will be the Windows temp SMSTS log file folder. This SMSTS log folder. But for light touch, it will be the x:/mini-nt SMS OSD. I can't type. OSD logs. That's in the very beginning. And if it breaks at that point and the machine reboots, everything that could help you troubleshoot is completely gone because it was in RAM. How do you prevent the reboot? F8. Enabled by default in light touch, you have to enable it in config manager on the boot image. But that will give you two things. First, you will get a command prompt, so you can debug the log files. Two, it prevents the reboot. So, two good things there. So, as soon as the sequence actually starts, creates a partition on the drive, it will actually continue to log in different locations as well. So, for config manager, it will be, if you're lucky, on the C drive, but it could be another drive letter as well. Same goes for light touch, but they will be here for config manager. Why can this one be different? Well, because drive letters in Windows PE are temporary. Sometimes it will be D, E, F, S, U, W, depending on what the MDT scripts think about it. So sometimes you need to check on it. For light touch, well, easy, it will be here for a long, long time. Config manager, as soon as the client gets installed, you will see that it will start to log into the client logs folder. And when it's done, it will move it back one level to this location. For light touch, well, it will be here again for a long, long time, but in the very end, you will find the stuff in the temp deployment logs folder. That's the final resting place. Now, to get them server-side, it's not too hard. Can show it as config manager, but it's the same for light touch. You simply specify in your settings package, wherever you store it, SD, settings, Windows 10. This one right here. If you enable this setting, when a deployment fails, or when it completes successfully, the log files will be copied to this location. And it will create a folder for each computer name that you deploy. So what log files are being copied to this location? Well, obviously the SMSTS log file and BDD log file for light touch, but actually a bunch more. The feature that grabs this is actually smart enough to grab other stuff for you that can help you debug the setup. So the script is actually a complete array of files that MDT integration looks for. It's basically scanning the entire client drive for these files and copy them back to server for you. So for example, what do you find in this folder? Could be the sysprep log file, yes, which is the same as the setup log file, which is what? What's the name of it? The .10 XML file can be in that folder, but the log file for setup is setup.act.log. It's been like that for, well, since XP, give or take. This one can be very useful when you troubleshoot in-place upgrades of Windows 10. This one then, useful for what? For debugging domain join issues. It will tell you exactly why a machine couldn't join the domain. Most likely, you type in the wrong OU, or that the account that you're using to join machines into domain, you type in the wrong password, or the account that you're using doesn't have permissions to do it. This log file will tell you exactly that. Most of the other log files are MDT-specific actions, but for example, if the sequence injects drivers, or tries to inject drivers, you will also see there will be another log file in this folder, the dism log file, that can help you troubleshoot why it couldn't inject drivers. I'll come back to that later. So it's a pretty smart feature. You create a folder, you enable this, you're good to go. You update the package. Then you have everything server-side, in addition to the client-side logging. Right, I'm just going to save this for now. For those of you using Config Manager, how many are using Config Manager? Most of the room, okay. 60%. You have more options than you have in Light Touch. Light Touch basically only offers this. But in Config Manager, you have much more information being passed back from the setup up to the server in forms of status messages. And you can review this information in quite many different ways. So, for example, I have a task sequence here that is named debug. I have deployed this to a collection, obviously, and this deployment ID is the one that is connected to this sequence. So if I wanted to troubleshoot that deployment, I have a few different options. I can go to the monitoring node, and I can go to reports, find progress reports, and of course, select to run a report to get the progress of a single sequence that I obviously select in the report. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to create a query. This is a normal status message query, simple select statement. But as you can see in that select statement, I'm querying for that specific deployment ID. So now I can run this. And I'm not sure if it's a feature in 15.11 or not, or if it's actually supposed to be that way. But when you run this query, you will often see that it becomes a bit unresponsive for a little bit, and then it continues. So give it a few seconds here. You may have seen it went to non-responding real quick up in the title bar and then continue. But this is all the information that has been passed up through a deployment that I did earlier today of this task sequence. I can't double-click them or anything, but I have information out here about my deployment. So I can actually follow it and see what it did, because it actually outputs information back to the server, and sometimes this is enough to help me troubleshoot something. I can also use this to query for failed deployments. Not responding, coming. So how do I look for failed deployments? What's the status message code? You know this, sir. It's 11170. And luckily, I won't have any. Successful deployment then. 11171. I have a successful deployment. Why is this useful? Well, we can use this together with status filter rules in Config Manager. On the site level, if I can click Site, right-click, status filter rules. You can create filter rules, message ID, you give it a name, you typically select the sequence component as well, and you can say do something when you get that status message ID. Run a script, run a program, email someone, report to the event log. This is quite powerful, being able to trigger on either failed or successful deployments so that help desk can get an email. I put together a blog post a little while back, just, well, this weekend I think it was. Yes, wake up, thank you. I promise I had internet connectivity 2 seconds ago. As in had. Or just very slow. Try again. Here. Have config manager send an email. But not only sending the email, actually parse the log files as well for warnings and errors and include them in the email. You can simply add that to your sequence, which I was doing here. I know Michael has a script on his blog as well that does a similar thing, but he attaches the log file. The same concept. But again, allowing you to get information about things going wrong, allow you to act on things quickly, which is, well, nice. So, PXE then. In general, when you have PXE issues with Config Manager and Light Touch, MDT, it's not your fault. In general. Most of these issues are networking issues. So you need to be friends with the networking group. Meaning you basically need to have a standing subscription to Systembolaget or what's it called here? Vinmonopolet, yes. For a nice bottle of scotch that you every once in a while get from that store and bring to the networking group and say, here you go, well done guys, top notch. Because without their support you never fix this, ever. The most reliable way of getting networking and PXE work together is to be friends with that group and to have them configure IP helpers for you in the network switches. It's technically possible to use the ETP scope options. But I've seen so many scenarios, I've seen so much hardware simply that doesn't like that configuration at all. IP helpers works every single time. The HTTP scope options may work, but IP helpers always work. But then, of course, there are some things you have to do client-side, server-side. So let me just start a machine so that we get a PXE actually going. Can steal this one. Go to clean snapshot, power it on. It's a Gen 2 VM, so it's UEFI, so I have to press enter instead of F12. It will now download the boot image over the network. You can increase the RAM disk block size so it actually downloads faster for UEFI-based machines. But typically, be a bit careful doing it over 8K because you will have a lot of hardware not being able to actually cope with that. If you're lucky, it can do 16K and then it downloads real fast. But at this point in time, I'm doing a config manager deployment. And on the server side, there is a log file. So if I open up the installation directory for config manager, logs, and this will be on each and every distribution point, obviously. So I will have an SMS PXE log file. And in this log file, if I scroll down to the end of it, I will actually see that this specific MAC address, which was the machine I started, it was actually looking for a deployment for it. Eventually found it, and eventually served it with a boot image. So, found advertisement, life is good. So if you get an abort PXE, check this one. It's most likely that you did a deployment and you configured it wrong. Because when you deploy a sequence, you need to tell it whether it should be available for PXE or not. Any of these three options. But the default one is this, so if you just click enter, you might miss it, and then you can't PXE boot it. But the log file will tell you that. Other things you can use to troubleshoot this is to go into the remote install folder, go into the SMS boot folder, and verify that you do have 7 netboot files for 32 and for 64-bit. If you don't have that, well, restart Windows Deployment Services and it will extract it one more time for you into that folder. Prior to R2, it was easy to miss this because you needed to check that on every boot image that you created, at least one for each architecture. But now Config Manager does it for you. So the default boot images are actually configured to do this. So as long as you just go into your DP and you enable PXE, life will be, that's not a DP. It's a site, it's a difference. There is a PXE tab. When you enable that, it will copy the files. But the same goes for the boot images that your sequence is using. So for example, this sequence is configured to use the following boot image, Zero Touch WinPE 10. And obviously that boot image needs to be configured in the customization data source tab to be PXE enabled. And it needs to be distributed too, to a DP. Because when you do that, when you distribute it and when you check this box, what will happen is that in the remote install folder, there will be an SMS images folder. And if you look on the image ID of the boot image, it ends with a 6. You will find there is this one here that contains the boot image. So SMS PXE log file, boot image properties, deployments, and Scotch, whiskey for networking people. And you're good to go. And IP helpers. That normally fixes most of your PXE problems. Then what? Well, you PXE boot, you download a boot image, you start to work your way through a deployment. If the sequence breaks, the default behavior is it will reboot after 15 minutes. Meaning, ladies and gentlemen, if you start the deployment here in Spectrum in Oslo, and then you go down to get some coffee or eventually beer later tonight from the vendors in the expo area, and then you come back half an hour later to check on your deployment. If that failed while you were away, the stuff that could help you troubleshoot is gone, most of it. You still have status messages on the server. But if it failed early, the machine rebooted, and everything that could help you debug was in RAM, and it's gone. You just will see an error message saying, boot manager is missing, have fun. So what I like to do, and what I recommend you to do, is to simply go to your sequence and change that behavior. In this case, I'm adding a timeout for a full workday. So 24 hours. And hopefully you have, your deployments are not going that, taking that long. Should be good. Something I also like to add, especially for Windows 8 and Windows 10 deployments, is this one. It will force a group policy refresh when you're done. And it will also mitigate a problem that I've seen, not now with 15.11 on Windows 10 anymore, but with the RTM version, and especially for Windows 8 deployments. Don't deploy Windows 8. It will look like this. You've probably seen it. It only happens once. You try to log on, you get this, and you click OK, you log on again, and it works. But it's pretty annoying. The action that I showed you in the sequence fixes this. And it's the same for Windows 10 as well. It looks like this then. But I have not seen it yet in 15.11. In any way, this is a nice thing to add. Post action, shutdown command, 5 seconds, done. Fix the problem. Also, what can be very useful is if I want to debug something, I can add a break somewhere. So if I, for example, are debugging why the partitioning failed, typically because I had third-party disk encryption, I can add a break in here. So what I have done in my settings package, not my settings package, my MDT package, which is, by the way, where you want to add all your custom scripts that you're using for OSD to this special package, not to a separate package. Why use this package for your custom scripts? This one is always staged to the local hard drive throughout the entire sequence. The script is always available to you. And that's the only package that are being staged this way on the hard drive. So anyway, in here I have a script. CDI pause WinPE is just a simple VB script that looks for a text file. As long as that text file doesn't exist, it will pause. When I want the sequence to continue, I create a text file, it continues. But the thing is, I can start a deployment now. I can go back in here and type in the password. I will select my sequence. I will wait patiently until it formats the drive. Of course, I can open up cmtrace, the command prompt, and run cmtrace. Can adjust the font a little bit. Now you see use toolkit package. This is where it's actually staging the MDT package on the drive. But of course, I can run cmtrace, I can open the log files and check on things this way. But what I also can do is, as soon as this one is done, I can go into the sequence folder, and soon I will have another folder than just packages. It's coming. It's going to wipe the disk one more time. It's a config manager thing to format twice. It does that. And then it downloads the same package one more time. At least I removed the timeout in MDT 2013 update 1 already. Before it was a 30-second timeout here in the script, which a developer added back in the days. They fixed that one now. It's coming. Here we go, WD package. I will have my scripts folder. This is where I will have my CDI pause script, for example. But I also have a script that will enumerate my settings and dump them to the console for me, or maybe to a text file. And then I can review that text file in Notepad. and check on my settings. I have disabled BitLocker, host name, it's apparently a desktop. All VMs are desktops. It's UEFI, it was generation 2 VM. It will put the machine in that OU in Active Directory when it's done, or later. So you'll see a lot of information about the deployment that can help you do things. The retry counts for management state migration points. Post-action commands, timeouts, passwords for user accounts being used by the sequence is also here. So, yeah, fun stuff. Can help you debug things. So I will just close this one for now. Now, this is something I have run into every other release of Config Manager. I run into this a lot when upgrading from SP1 to R2, but not from R2 to SP1, R2 SP1. But I've seen this going from R2 SP1 to 1511, the current branch. The scenario is, in some network configurations, you start a deployment, like I did, you type in the password like I did, but when you click next, and it tries to find the sequences, it doesn't find them. You just get an error message say, whoop, can't find a sequence, or no task sequence is found. And it happens like that. How do you fix that if that happened to you? You set these variables. Okay, cool. How do you set these variables? You can't really set them in the sequence because the problem you are having is that you don't get the sequence. You don't get the policies down to the client quickly enough. So how do you fix this? You do some magic. In Config Manager, there is a way to have the boot image do things early on in the process. It's called a pre-start command. You can configure it on the boot image. Here. And what command line to use and what files to include in that. So what you do is you create a config file. That looks like this. You place that in the root of the boot image, either by mounting it and copy the file, or by using the properties on the boot image that I showed you just 10 seconds ago. And then you obviously add the scripts as well. And this is a very high-tech script. I spent a lot of time working on this. 3 lines. Simply sets the variables and give the boot image more time to find the policies. MDT Light Touch doesn't have this problem. It's only Config Manager. But I've started to see this now when we do 1511 upgrades. In networks that work perfectly fine in R2 SP1. So I don't know if it's a feature, but I know how to fix it. So keep that somewhere in the back of your head that if that happens, there is a fix. Set those variables, and life should be good. Another thing, of course, come on, is drivers. And it's not only one type of driver, it's different drivers depending on if it's the boot image or the OS itself. So if I start another deployment, I'm going to start a light touch deployment from a media, because it's the same for Config Manager and Light Touch. And to do that, I need a server running. Helps. It's coming. Client, clean snapshot, boot image. I will pick my Production ISO. The reason I pick an ISO is because I also have PXE on my MDT server, and when you have two PXE servers on the same subnet, well, they kind of fight. But by using an ISO, I prevent that. This is, by the way, a boot image I was using for the System Center Universe conference in Dallas. Every speaker had to include a Star Wars team at some point in their presentation. It was like a sort of a to-do thing. So I added a background image of the Millennium Falcon doing, you know, the light speed jump. Sidebar. Anyway, open up a command prompt. Normally, if you do an ipconfig, you're supposed to see like this. It's supposed to show you an IP address. That's the deal. What if it doesn't? What if it returns blank? Well, it means you don't have the driver in the boot image. And if you don't have the drivers, what you shouldn't do is go into your MDT server and add it, or go into Config Manager and add it. That's not what you should do. Instead, you find a machine that you have internet access on, you download the driver you think it needs, or a bunch of drivers that you think it needs, you put them on a USB stick, and you plug the USB stick into the computer that you are troubleshooting. And then you are using driver load, and you specify the path to where the driver is. Path to inf file. You get the idea. Driver load on the file. And then you start network manually and see if it works. So how do you start network? This file, you run it. And you check if that returned when you do an ipconfig, you get a MAC address, an IP address. Because it allows you to test different drivers very quickly until you figure out that, okay, this one is actually working. And you find out that very quickly in 10, 15 seconds. That's the driver you will add to your MDT server or to your config manager server. There is a log file as well, WP init log. It will actually show you how much time Windows PE spent on installing network and what driver it tried to use for what type of device. So that can also help you with some information about why it couldn't find the driver. Now, whatever you do for deployments, for light touch, when you work with boot image drivers, create a folder for it and add only the boot image drivers to that folder. Create a selection profile that is configured for that folder as a filter. And then configure your deployment share for drivers to use that filter, making sure it's only the drivers that you add to that folder that gets added to the boot image. I've seen so many customers just importing drivers, not configuring this, and they are surprised that I have a 650 meg boot image with a bunch of drivers in it. Don't do that. Be restricted. Only add the drivers that you need. You don't need wireless drivers in a boot image. MDT will happily add it for you if you don't set the filter. Config Manager is easy, because now since R2SP1, it actually prevents you from doing stupid things as well. It prevents you from adding drivers that do not work in a boot image. For example, injecting a 32-bit one to a 64-bit boot image. Because already when you import a driver these days, if I specify a folder here, where I have some drivers, those the driver source, Windows PE 10. It spent a lot of time validating the driver itself. The code is not very good, but if you try to inject that into the wrong boot image, it will actually warn you and say you can't do this. So this is good. In terms of operating system drivers, the way I recommend to do things is simply in light touch. You do it on a per model basis, meaning this is not okay. This is the default behavior in light touch. This is adding all the drivers into one component and hope it works. Hope is not good. So create a folder, name your model name or whatever you have. And put the drivers for that model in that folder. And refresh the view. Go back to your sequence and configure the sequence to look for a model folder. This is how you do it in light touch. Config manager, much easier. Create a driver package for each model. And configure your sequence to use that driver package. Set a condition on it. For troubleshooting purposes, it's very often you add the right drivers, and then you look into Device Manager, and it looks like this. And you get sad, and you cry. Config Manager and MDT has a way of injecting drivers. First, the sequence will copy the driver. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. Task sequence, copy the drivers locally to the package folder. It will call on DISM to inject the driver. It will then allow setup to actually install the driver. So 3 different actions is actually happening in this point. For this one to troubleshoot, simply check the log file. It's that easy. Or you can go totally wild and crazy and search for the file. I have an idea here. If you can't find the file, it wasn't copied. And you need to go back to recheck your package or your condition or something. There is a log file here. DISM log. Rarely now these days you have to debug this. Back in MDT 2010, when WinPE was before version 5, when you had scratch space issues, you don't have that anymore. It was very common that it couldn't stage the drive because it ran out of disk space. Now it sets to the highest level always. Well, if you have a gig memory machine. And also because both MDT and Config Manager does some really good validation of the drivers at import. But this one is interesting because this one will rank the driver. And you'll find information about it in log files. And the deployment bunny over there in the stairway, Michael, he has a blog post about this. Ranking. This is equally equivalent for Windows 10. An explanation on how Windows actually go about injecting drivers and ranking drivers and picking the right driver. Because sometimes when you have a driver, you need to modify it so it actually picks that driver before another driver. And this is where you need to change a driver. But what happens when you change a driver? You break the signing, and it will lose in ranking. Config Manager won't even import it. It just refuses. MDT allows you to import it, but it whines about it. So let me see. I wrote a blog post back in the days on how to sign your own drivers. I upgraded it to Server 2012 R2, And I also have one for Server 2016 somewhere. Yeah. Same story there. The drivers is broken, or Intel has broken the driver on purpose. You need to modify it to get it to work. You sign it, you buy a certificate, life is good, and both MDT and Config Manager are now super happy about that driver. So if needed, you can make a driver better to have Config Manager and MDT use it, for example, before another driver. And the Bunny post explains how that works. All right. So that was drivers. There are things that you can do to make your life easier. Just because they did have a sellout at Clas Ohlson on computers, you don't have to buy one of each model they were selling out that day. You can reduce the number of models that you buy. You can buy in larger bulks. The thing is, fewer models equals less pain for you guys. We had a pre-conference yesterday, Config Manager pre-conference, and I've seen my fair share of interesting OST solutions out there in my days. We had one customer having 2 models for that many machines. That's a record in that direction. I had another customer having 296 models for 3,500 machines. I will argue and say it's easier to support 2 models than 300. Check. So buy fewer models or spend time on certifying hardware. Okay. I already did the demo there, so we should be good. Now, Windows 10 comes with a new scenario, the in-place upgrade one, which is quite interesting because when you do an in-place upgrade, you're just not applying a WIM file anymore. You're running setup. Something that Config Manager and MDT took away like 5 years ago. But the deal is, when you run a setup, things can go wrong. Many things. So first of all, this is a Windows 8 box, obviously. I will mount a Windows 10 ISO. This one. I will run setup. It's coming, it's thinking, it's, here we go. From an elevated command prompt. Hello. Go to my E drive, run a setup. It will fail. It doesn't tell you that it fails, but it fails. How do you debug this? I gave you a hint before. There was a log file, right? Where is that log file? The setup act log file, where is it? You don't see it. The folder is hidden. It's the Windows BT folder. Sources, Panther, setup act log. It is not written for CM trace, but it actually works great to review in CM trace. So now you can see it's actually looping through the setup, and eventually it will fail. Why will it fail? Because this is a Windows 8 Enterprise, and I mounted a Windows 10 Pro ISO, and you can't do downgrades. You can only do upgrades. But the log file would tell me this. And the cool thing is that, I'm just going to kill this one, you can fake a deployment. By adding this switch /compat scan only to the setup. And then we'll only do a check. If you have antivirus software that would prevent it from running, if you have too little disk space, things like that. And even cooler, as I demonstrated yesterday, in the config manager upgrade sequence, not properties, edit. Hello, can you give me an edit view? Thank you. Config manager is not really meant for 720 resolution. There is a checkbox. Hey, run setup without starting the upgrade. Just test it. Will it work? And then you can review the log file and check on things. So this is very, very, very nice. All right, in-place upgrade. Monitoring. Well, number 9 actually belongs to number 10, because this is a nice feature. The deal is, in MDT, you can enable monitoring, and it's really difficult because you need to go to your properties on the deployment chair, and you need to select the checkbox, Enable Monitoring. That's the entire server configuration. Then, when you create your boot images, you have the option of adding in Dart from MDOP if you have installed it and copied some files on the server. The same for Config Manager. If you have Dart installed, when you have the console and you create the boot images, you can add Dart. And what that will give you is the following. If I go to the client that I have here, I will log in to start the deployment. I will select my Windows 10 sequence and the equivalent for Config Manager, obviously. Give it a name, PC, NIC, 07, whatever, 6. I will select some apps, cool, start my deployment. Now I can go back to my server, to the workbench, to the monitoring node, press refresh. I have my machine. I can check on it. That's the monitoring feature. But I can also remote into it from the server. MDT and Config Manager. And the nice thing about Dart these days, if you renewed your subscription after that date, you have it included. Prior to that, you had to pay for it. And as it happens, they actually also increased the size or price of the subscription, but that's another story. So with that, I have 2 things left for you. Me and Michael, we spent the last vacation writing a Windows 10 deployment book. It's available on Kindle, on Amazon, and a bunch of stuff. Kent has written a nice book about Config Manager, R2. He has an upcoming EMS book as well, on the way out. And there is another MVP at this conference, Olaf Twitt, who has a really warm heart for a foundation, Save the Children Foundation. So this slide deck will be available, and if you want to support that cause, this is the information to do that. So with that, I have a full 20 seconds left. Thank you guys. Have a great conference.